Good day, everyone. My name is Raika Allah Ofantes, and I will be discussing the various assessments, strategies, and tools. We all know that we have the six types of various of assessment. First, the formative assessment. Second is the summative assessment. Third is the diagnostic assessment. Fourth is the placement assessments. Fifth is the traditional assessment. And sixth and final of all is the authentic assessment. But first, let me discuss the first type of assessment, the formative assessment. So we all know when we talk about the formative assessment, that is formal, which it means at the beginning and during the instruction, we have that formative assessment. Why we have that? It is because it is important for us to have that, enable for us to adjust what is the strategies we need to change, enable for our students to easily understand our topic, and enable for us to achieve a good learning and teaching process. Second, we have the summative assessment. So at the summative assessment, that is at the end of the discussion. So it is means you are evaluating your student. You are knowing your students if your student has learned something from you, even if it is about the performance test or any type of assessment. So third, we have the diagnostic. So in diagnostic, aims to detect the learning problems or difficulties. You are aiming to learn what is the difficulties, the problems of your student, enable for you to identify what is the proper strategies, methods, techniques that you should use, enable for your students to learn something, and enable for you to have a good interaction for your students. Next, we have the placement assessment. So here in the placement assessment, you are knowing what your students have learned before the assessment. So you are knowing what your students have already learned. You are knowing your students. So here in the placement assessment, an example of this is the entrance examination, which is we are giving entrance examination if the student have learned something from their previous lessons or their previous school days, something like that. So next we have the traditional assessment. This is a refers use of conventional strategies or tools to provide information about the learning of the students. So here in the traditional assessment, you are using an example of this is using the paper and pencil. Like you are doing that, enable for your students to easily understand, to easily know the topic that you have discussed in the previous lessons. Next, we have the authentic assessment. So here in that authentic assessment, you are using a real life situation or scenarios. Enable for your students to easily know what what they have already learned. Enable for your students to give something or to emphasize something that this type is very important because I have learned something from this. Isinasa puso nila. They are actually relating because you are focusing in a real life scenarios or situations. Next, we have the classification of assessment. Enable for us to know the classification of assessment. First, let me discuss the educational assessment. So in educational assessment, it is used in the school setting to track the growth of learners, enable for us to know if the students have already learned something, if the students have already grown a lot of things from us, and to also grade their performance. Next, we have the psychological assessment. Here in the psychological assessment, you are assessing psychologically. Just like, for example, you are knowing if there is any problems for your student, measuring and determining the learner's cognitive and non-cognitive characteristics. If they are actually learning something from you or not, something like that. And one of the example of psychological test is you are going to the psychiatrist, you are giving psychological tests, you are giving some advice if what you will do, something like that, if you have problems that you have faced. So next is the paper and pencil assessment. Cognitive test that requires a single correct answer. It is a form of test type such as binary, true or false, short answer, matching type, and multiple choice. So this paper and pencil assessment is very relevant or very useful in to us as students, because here in the paper and pencil you are actually not just assessing, but you are actually interpreting what you have learned from the previous discussion that your that your teacher had already discussed. Next, we have the performance based assessment. You are performing like demonstration, product, you are giving some projects, strategies, and present information. Just like, for example, you are performing some dance. That is also one of the example of assessment. So next we have the standardized test and the non-standardized. So have fixed direction, administering, and scoring. So fixed na siya, standardized. It is fixed. So while non-standardized, it is teacher-made. Tasks are usually intended for classroom assessment. Parang siya, hindi siya fixed. Hindi siya all good sa lahat. So parang teacher-made siya. Ginagawa siya ng teacher. Hindi siya para dun sa kabilang section, hindi siya ganun. Kasi yung standardized, para sa lahat. Yung non-standardized, that is the teacher-made assessment. So next, we have the speed test. Speed test simply measure the speed with which test takers can perform a task. You are actually measuring the speed of the students in performing a particular task. Next, we have the power test. Well, the power test, you are measuring the strength, which is there are no time limit. Next, we have the norm reference from criterion reference. When we talk about the norm reference, it is interpreting the student's performance. You are interpreting the student's performance. While the criterion reference interpretation is that you are interpreting the assessment. Gets? Sa norm, you are interpreting the performance. Sa criterion, you are interpreting the assessment. So that is you are interpreting the test assessment. So that is the pinagkaiba. Next, we have the strategies tools. So the strategies tools that we commonly use is one of the example is also the paper and pencil, the questionnaires that we are giving to them, the test, the simulations, the interviews, feedback processes. So that is the strategies that we are giving to our students, enable for us to know if they are already learning. So this, my report is very important and very vital as a future teacher to enable for us to know what we should consider in reteaching, and enable for us to know if our students had already learned something from us. So this is very important and plays a vital role in teaching to achieve a good teaching and learning process and to achieve the things that we put in our objectives.
Hello and welcome to Teachings in Education, the purpose of assessments. So, what is the overall goal of using assessments? Educators must use assessments as a tool to improve instruction. Improving student learning will always be the primary goal of assessments. It must be used formatively to pinpoint when students become lost. When students are lost, teachers can intervene through assessments. Teachers can decide to reteach, move on, or change teaching strategies. Now, on a larger scale, assessments are used for evaluation as well, which is different. Assessments still evaluate whether or not students are learning to read, write, and do math, When it comes to standardized testing, they serve the purpose of identifying gaps within an entire school or a classroom. So assessments can identify deficits in both the classroom and schools as well. It's always important in both life and in education that we learn from our mistakes. And teachers should want to show students that hard work pays off. Assessments provide intrinsic motivation and a payoff for studying very hard.
So that would be all. Thank you.